Thank you very much. It's great to be back in the Midwest. I was raised in Missouri, Iowa, Nebraska, and as a matter of fact, I lived right here in Kansas City in my youth. So, the greatest people in the world as far as I'm concerned. And last night I went out and took a little walk, and I was over in Kansas, Topeka, Kansas, and I got a breath of that fresh air because I've lived quite a few years in Los Angeles, so I know I really did enjoy coming back here. Let me just start by saying that after I retired, I learned about a number of matters which were very shocking to me. Before my retirement, when I was in the FBI, I can honestly say I was never exposed or had no knowledge at all whatsoever of any possible corrupt situations. Of course, I had the privilege of having served under that great American J. Edgar Hoover for 21 years, till he passed away in May of 1972. And don't you let our adversaries tell you anything different. They have put out disinformation, and he is the victim of an extensive disinformation program that he's a homosexual. He was not a homosexual. Instead of making him a homosexual and a degenerate, I'm sure they would love to say that too, they've tried. I must say he was an American hero. Instead, they've taken people who were sympathetic to the communist movement and made heroes out of them. As far as I'm concerned, schools and streets right today should be named after J. Edgar Hoover. As Ephraim Zimbalist said to me once, I play golf with Ephraim once in a while, when the lion is dead, the rats come out of the woodwork, and that's the case with Mr. Hoover. But anyway, in my bureau career, people have asked me, didn't you see any corruption? No, I did not see any corruption. And possibly because in the Bureau, at the time of my retirement, there were 164 categories. If any cases came in that fell in those 164 categories, we investigated it. Otherwise, it went in what we call a zero basket. And we did a great job. These included kidnapping, bank robbery, extortion, skyjackings. I handled the skyjacking personally, negotiated with the skyjacker July 12, 1972, Philadelphia International Airport. Background checks, Communist Party USA, Black Panthers, internal security, espionage, and the list goes on and on and on. We had a great record. I'm sorry to say that the Bureau has changed. There's no question about it. The FBI today, in 1996, is being used by the politicians to further their gains and their goals. So, there are a few things that have happened to me, some major matters that have happened to me since my retirement. And most recently, I was giving a lecture in Las Vegas, and I sat at the head table next to a gentleman. And this gentleman, in his day, had been in naval intelligence, and he was telling me that on December the 4th, 1941, 3 days before Pearl Harbor, he was in the communications room in Washington, D.C., a naval intelligence officer, and we received, the U.S. government received a communication, an intercept of Japanese message that had been sent, and we had broken the Japanese code, and this message stated that we were going to bomb Pearl Harbor on December the 7th. He was very elated to have received this. He passed it up to his superior passed it on. After the war was over, he came back to Washington, D.C., and was told he was going to have to testify. They had a congressional hearing on this. He was given a subpoena. His boss called him in and said, even though you have a subpoena, you're not going to testify. And he said, well, I don't understand this. He says, look, you don't understand now, someday you will. You're not going to testify. And he didn't testify. Now, it's been documented, and I've heard it on a number of occasions, that we knew about Pearl Harbor in advance. This is the first time I've had information directly from a person who was aware of this. I also received some information recently in my tours and lectures and what have you. I did a TV show in Long Beach, California. One of the gentlemen involved in the show was in the U.S. Army at one time. He told me that in the spring of 1973, we had bombed all of the North Vietnamese supply lines. We had mined their harbors. They were cut off. And one of his associates was in the communication room in Saigon. And this is, of course, a classified job. And when he was in this room, he received this message from the North Vietnamese: we surrender unconditionally. He passed it on to his superiors, And all Army personnel were immediately ushered out and replaced by State Department personnel. It was shortly thereafter that Kissinger met with the North Vietnamese officials in Paris, France. Why do these things happen? Why did we not take advantage of the advance notice of Pearl Harbor? And why is it necessary for us to be subservient to North Vietnam when we obviously have won? I think at the end of this lecture, you may have the answer. In fact, I'm sure you'll have the answer. I think you'll understand much better than you do and have in recent years. Anyway, when I first came out of the FBI, as I said, I came out in 1979. Attorney General Griffin Bell hired me to coordinate security for the Pan American Games. Attorney General Griffin Bell was under Jimmy Carter, President Jimmy Carter. And I went to San Juan, Puerto Rico for the summer of '79. Great experience. I lived with the athletes, 5,500 athletes in the village there. And I'm happy to report that America's softball team, girls softball team I might add, adopted me as their mascot. So I have a nice softball autographed by all the ladies of our softball team. In fact, I even rode to all the games with them on the bus. But anyway, they won the gold medal, of course. That's beside the point. But I had a great experience. And I came back and started my own international security consulting firm in Los Angeles, California. And I was a consultant for the '84 Olympics in Los Angeles. And one of my first cases that I handled, I was contacted by some of Dr. Jeffrey R. McDonald's doctor friends. I don't know if you remember the movie Fatal Vision, the book Fatal Vision. This was the former Green Beret doctor, and he was a doctor at Fort Bragg, North Carolina. On February the 17th, 1970, he was asleep in his living room. It was a house on Castle Drive on the base. It was an open base, however. And he was awakened by two white males, a black male in E6 sergeant stripes with camouflage jacket, and also by a white female with a floppy white hat and a long blonde wig. The white female had lights flickering across her face. She was chanting, "Acid is groovy, kill the pigs, acid is groovy, kill the pigs." The two white males, one had a knife, one had an ice pick. The black male with the E6 sergeant stripe camouflage jacket on had a 32-inch bed slat. We found out later it was actually a bed slat, but to McDonald at that time it was just a post of some, or a pole of some sort. And Dr. McDonald wrapped, according to him, wrapped his hands and his wrists with his pajama tops and was feinting off the blow. While he was fighting with them, he heard his daughter say, "Jeff, Jeff, help me, help me." And he heard his daughter, yeah, it's a 5.5-year-old daughter say that, and his wife yelling, "Jeff, Jeff, why are they doing this to me? Why are they doing this to me?" He felt a sharp pain to his right side. He awoke probably an hour and 15 minutes later, maybe hour and a half. He was half in the living room, half in the hallway. Total silence in the house. He went back. Here was his wife with 26 stab wounds in her chest. The children had numerous stab wounds in their bodies. All three of them were killed. The government, it was on a government reservation, the government claimed that Dr. McDonald went to bed and he noticed that the 5.5-year-old child who was sleeping with the mother had wet the bed, and he had a big argument with his wife, and because of this argument over the child wetting the bed, he wiped out the whole family. It's absolutely ridiculous. But anyway, so I was asked by some of Dr. McDonald's friends to investigate the case. And I told Dr. McDonald, I said, if you're guilty, as soon as I find out you're guilty, I'm not going to investigate any further. If you're innocent, I'll go right to the mat with you. Now, the gentleman had just been convicted in August 1979 of these three murders, even though the murders had been committed some 9 years prior to this. There were a number of appeals, and he was not indicted by the grand jury until 1974, so that was the reason for the delay. So I entered the case, and I noticed in reviewing the case, going through records, and I spent hours reading all kinds of material, the court dockets and testimony, etc. I noticed that skin that was in Colette's fingernails was turned over to William F. Ivory, who was the chief investigator for the Army, and it disappeared. Dr. McDonald did not have a scratch mark on him. The skin obviously was from one of the assailants. Colette being the wife. From skin, you can tell what type blood the person is who was scratched, right? That just plain disappeared off the earth. Also, in reviewing the records, I noted that there were 14 candle wax drippings in the house. And remember now, Colette had light flickering across her face. And these candle wax drippings, including one that was in the child's bed sheet, were foreign to any other candles and candle wax found in the house. I also noted that an FBI agent, hairs and fibers expert named Paul Stombaugh, lied to the grand jury, and if you want documentation on that, you can read the book Fatal Vision by McGinnis. And in there, it states that he testified before the grand jury and said that the hair in Colette's right hand was Colette's hair. Well, what happened was they found that Colette had hair in her hand. They tested it against Dr. McDonald's. It did not match, so it had to come from someplace. So they said it was Colette's. You cannot say that hair is identical. You can say it's similar. You can say it's cut, pulled, peroxide, what part of the body it came from, and it's similar. I noticed also that according to Helena Stokely, I obtained a confession from her on October 25, 1980. I brought her back to L.A. That's a story by and of itself. And Helena Stokely told me that it was her satanic cult group that went into the house that night. And it was her initiation into the group. And I said, what is this all about? And that was really the first I learned about Satanism. But Helena told me that to prove that she was in the house, that she had attempted to ride the rocking horse in the child's bedroom. The spring was broken. She wouldn't have known about that otherwise. She told me that that there was a jewelry box. I asked her specifically, was there anything, arrangement of the furniture, draw the diagrams of the house and so forth? She did that. I asked her about a jewelry box on the master bedroom dresser. She said there was a jewelry box there. I had her describe it. And she described it. I went down and got a Sears and Roebuck catalog. I showed her the catalog. She picked out the box. It was identical with it. She talked about also that there was something unusual happened that night. She said that right in the middle of all this commotion and this fighting, that the phone rang. And I said, well, what happened? And she said, well, I answered the phone, and there was a man asked for Dr. McDonald. And I said, well, then what happened after that? And she said, well, Dwight Smith, who was the person she identified as also being there, there were some 7 individuals involved in the crime, said, hang up the GD phone. And so she hung up the phone. Well, later on, I found out through my investigative effort that the person who made that call was a fellow named James Fryer, and he was in the penitentiary in western North Carolina, out of Asheville, North Carolina. And I called the warden. I made arrangements to go out and interview him on a Saturday morning. Well, when I arrived out there that morning, can you guess what happened? He had escaped the night before. And in developing additional information on the case, I learned that one of the early prosecutors, Jim Proctor, was the judge's ex-son-in-law. He was divorced from his wife, but still the judge was a grandfather to the children. And I learned that the police intelligence files on this group of Satanists that Helena described by name gave me descriptions of exactly where each one of them went in the house, what happened, step by step. Intelligence files disappeared out of the Fayetteville Police Department files, and also out of Waycross, Georgia, because one of them had been arrested down there. I learned subsequently that there were 2 black fibers on Colette's tongue in her mouth. There was a black fiber on the 32-inch bed slat, and there was a black fiber wool on her chest, black wool, okay? Determined it was black wool. The FBI had in their notes, their handwritten notes, that it was black wool, and a question mark as to where it came from. When the report was filed, typed up, the formal report was typed up and filed and furnished to the defense, that information was left out. Now, in conducting my investigation, I learned that the only black wool in the house that night was Helena Stokely's skirt. She had on a black wool skirt. I also learned that as a result of my confession, and later on there were some other confessions, a girl named Kathy Perry confessed to the FBI, but she said that she was high on drugs, and there were two children, they were boys that were killed that night, so the FBI discounted it. There's another individual, Greg Mitchell, who was one of the assailants named by Helena Stokely, who confessed to the neighbors that he was involved in the murders. But to this day, to this very day, that man is still in jail, in spite of this overwhelming evidence that he's innocent. Now, to confirm and document that it was a satanic cult murder, there were several signs that were left behind. This is always usually the case. They always leave signs behind. There were unexplained bird feathers in the house. There was a headless doll. And the 2.5-year-old child had shallow ice pick, 10 shallow ice pick wounds in her chest in the form of an S. I asked Helena, I said, Helena, what did that S stand for? And she said, Satanism. So this was a shock to me. The McDonald case, this man's in jail. I couldn't understand it. I went on national television, a number of national TV shows. I debated Freddie Kassab, the father-in-law, on CNN. And also a psychiatrist was there. And I talked about this satanic aspect. And I had people calling me from all over the country, telling me the same basic story, from the East Coast to West Coast, North and South. And I had people that, what you call them multi-generation Satanists. That's somebody who was born into it, mother, father, grandfather, grandmother are involved in Satanism. And adult survivors, that's somebody that gets out, usually has to go into hiding to survive. I had these people call me from all over the country telling me about the ceremonies and about the extent of the satanic movement in this country today. So I started investigating it myself. I gave a number of lectures on it. I had some national exposure, of course. And the bottom line is it's very easily explained, and it fits into a pattern. And this goes back some 200 years. I'm going to use as a textbook tonight Pawns in the Game. It's a book that was written by William Guy Carr. He's a retired commander in the Canadian Naval Force. And he had heard about the conspiracy and wanted to delve into it himself. He wrote a very compact book about what's going on with the Illuminati and how this fits into modern-day plans, what's going on in the world today. So we're going to use that as a textbook for the first 2 hours. And the second 2 hours, we'll have some case studies. So let's start out by stating and by showing you. We'll start with this page in the prefix. And you see this, we'll start up here. In 1784, an act of God placed the Bavarian government in possession of evidence which proved the existence of the continuing Luciferian conspiracy. This explains the previous 9 pages, goes into it in detail. We don't have time to do it completely. Conspiracy. Adam Weishaupt, a Jesuit-trained professor of canon law, defected from Christianity and embraced the Luciferian ideology while teaching at Ingolstadt University. In 1770, the money lenders who had recently organized the House of Rothschild retained him to revise and modernize the age-old protocols designed to give the synagogue of Satan ultimate world domination so they can impose the Luciferian ideology upon what remains of the human race after the final social cataclysm by use of satanic despotism. Weishaupt completed his task on May the 1st, 1776. It's a communist holiday, isn't it? May 1, 1776. The plan required the destruction of all existing governments and religions. This objective was to be reached by dividing the masses, whom he termed goyim, meaning human cattle, into opposing camps in ever-increasing numbers on political, racial, social, economic, and other issues. The opposing sides were then to be armed, and an incident provided which would cause them to fight and weaken themselves as they destroyed national governments and religious institutions. In 1776, Weishaupt organized the Illuminati to put the plot into execution. The word Illuminati is derived from Lucifer and means holders of the light. Using the lie that his objective was to bring about a one-world government, to enable men with proven mental ability to govern the world, he recruited about 2,000 followers. These included the most intelligent men in the field of arts and letters, education, the sciences, finance, and industry. He then established lodges of the Grand Orient to be their secret headquarters. Weishaupt's revised plan required his Illuminati to do the following things to help them accomplish their purpose. 1, use monetary and sex bribery to obtain control of people already occupying positions in high places in the various levels of all governments and other fields of human endeavor. Once an influential person had fallen for the lies, deceits, and temptations of the Illuminati, they were to be held in bondage by application of political and other forms of blackmail and threats of financial ruin, public exposure, and physical harm, and even death to themselves and their loved ones. We're going to take these a point at a time. And then what I'm going to do, I'm going to show you what's going on in this country today. This is a recent headline, not too recent, 1989, June the 30th, 1989. Power broker served drugs, sex at parties, bugged for blackmail. Here's another headline. Homosexual prostitution probe ensnarls the fissures of the Bush and Reagan administration. Top Japanese politician linked to Spence. Craig Spence was a CIA operative. He was exposed as a CIA operative. His job was to set up dignitaries, politicians, congressmen, etc., and to blackmail them. Once he was exposed, of course, he didn't last too long. He lasted something like 6 months. Within 6 months, I think he was suicidal. Now, recently, it's sometimes referred to as Arkancided, by the way. Not Spence, though. This was before Mr. Bill Clinton was in the White House. But in my experience as a private investigator, security consultant over the last 17 years, I've had a number of high-profile cases in addition to the Jeffrey McDonald case. And I'm happy to report I've had a phenomenal success record on it. It takes a lot of time, a lot of diligence, and the right contacts in order to be successful in this field. But in 1989, I was contacted by a gentleman by the name of Ed Weaver, a wonderful Christian man in Lincoln, Nebraska. And he had read about me in a book called The Ultimate Evil by Maury Terry. The Ultimate Evil was a story about the Son of Sam murders in New York. And Maury Terry wrote the book. He contacted me on the West Coast, asked me to help him do the research on it, et cetera, which I did. Involved on the West Coast the murder of a producer named Roy Radin. And I'm happy to report that the people who were responsible for his contract murder or contract killing of Roy Radin are in jail today. There's 4 of them, serving all 4 of them serving life sentences with no parole. And I'm also happy to report that I had a little bit something to do with putting them in jail for the rest of their lives. But as a result of my name appearing in the book The Ultimate Evil, Ed called me and said, you know, are you the same Ted Gunderson that went to Lincoln High School in Lincoln, Nebraska, and went to the University of Nebraska? And I said, I am. He said, well, I'm Ed Weaver, and I was your classmate, and of course I remembered him. But he said, we have a real problem here in Nebraska. We have a case called the Franklin Cover-Up, and in this particular case, the FBI and the IRS raided the Franklin Credit Bureau, which was a credit bureau established in the minority neighborhood in order to furnish banking and financial opportunities to the minorities. People on the board of directors included people like Harold Anderson, who was past publisher of the Omaha World Herald, other very prominent citizens. And as a result of the raid, there was publicity. Larry King, by the way, was the individual who was president of the Savings and Loan. Not Larry King, live CNN, but Larry King, a black man, a fast-rising star in the Republican Party, had sung the national anthem at Texas at the Republican National Convention and New Orleans at the Republican National Convention. As a result of the publicity, there were 80 children in Omaha came forward and talked about being exposed and ritualistically and sexually victims of this element, this group of people. These were some of the leading businessmen in Omaha. These kids named not only Harold Anderson, but they also named Bob Wadman, chief of police, as being involved in this ring. They named Gene Mahoney, past former vice squad with the vice detective with the Omaha Vice Squad, Omaha, Nebraska, and he's now head of the Forestry Service for the state, has a park named after him between Lincoln and Omaha. They named the editor of the society page of the Omaha World Herald. They named the heir to the Brandeis fortune. I mean, these were top citizens, highly respected people in the community. And of these 80 children that came forward, 4 of them gave statements. Of the 4 who gave statements, 2 of them later recanted, probably under pressure. 2 refused to recant, Alicia Owens and Paul Benassi. And actually, what happened with Paul, they feel like they apparently discredited him because he had been convicted of child molestation. Alicia Owens claimed that she had sex with Bob Wadman, chief of police, when she was 14 years old. She told the grand jury that. And as a result, they tried her for perjury before the grand jury, and she was convicted. As far as I'm concerned, I attended the trial, a day of the trial, and it was a kangaroo court. There's no question in my mind. But this was the situation, and in discussing the matter, I did go back to Nebraska, of course, after talking to Ed. And I'm telling you right now about my experience there in talking to Paul and Alicia and so forth. But in talking to Paul, he gave me a number of signed statements. By the way, Gary Caradori, the investigator before me, died in an airplane crash coming out of Chicago. He had called they had a state Senate committee that was organized for the purpose of checking into this situation, this child sexual ring. And he had called the Senator, Lawrence Schmidt from Chicago. He was sent back there on a lead. Called Senator Schmidt, and said, I have the goods right now. They cannot get out of it. He got on an airplane that night, and the plane crashed outside of Chicago, about an hour and a half out of Chicago. And his briefcase is missing, and the back seat of the plane is missing. They claim that he had engine trouble and the plane disintegrated, but there was a farmer who saw a flash of fire and light, and he felt that it was very obvious to me and obvious to anybody else that there was probably a bomb in the plane. I can't prove it. This is what is being spread and thought about at the present time, and has been for some time. But anyway, Gary Caradori had done a great job on the case. I was not replacing him in full because I couldn't work full-time on it. I had a business in California. But in talking to Paul Benassi, he told me about the number of times when he and others were taken out of schools, private schools in Omaha, driven by limousine to Sioux City, Iowa, and placed on private jets and flown to Washington, D.C. for sex orgy parties with congressmen and senators. Paul told me, and has drawn for me, the living quarters of the White House. The public's not allowed in the living quarters of the White House. There's no question in my mind Paul is telling the truth. But in addition to this, he talked about an organized child kidnapping ring, which I will discuss later on in the lecture. We'll discuss that in the second half, by the way. But this is your documentation. This is what I'm saying. And by the way, Paul knew Craig Spence, knew him very closely, and had worked with Craig in setting some of these politicians up. So then we come back to the second point, and number 2 starts here. Illuminati on the faculties of colleges and universities were to recommend students possessing exceptional mental ability belonging to well-bred families with international learnings for special training in internationalism. This training was to be provided by granting scholarships to those selected. They were to be educated and indoctrinated into accepting the idea that only one world government can put an end to recurring wars and tribulations. They were to be at first persuaded and then convinced that men of special ability and brains had the right to rule those less gifted, because the goyim, that's us, folks, masses of the people, don't know what is best for them physically, mentally, and spiritually. Today, 3 such schools are located in Scotland, Germany, Greece, and so forth. So I think you're probably aware of the extent of recruitment that the government does on college campuses. That doesn't, of course, mean that necessarily applies here in every instance, but I have known of the extensive recruiting efforts by the CIA on college campuses. And the CIA, believe it, no question about it, there's an element of the CIA that's tied into this, and I'll document that as I go along later on. The next point, these are the goals now that are being set forth by the newly organized Illuminati. Influential people trapped into coming under the control of the Illuminati and students who had been specially educated and trained were to be used as agent tour and placed behind the scenes of all governments as experts and specialists so they could advise the top executives to adopt policies which would, in the long run, serve the secret plans of the one-worlders and bring about the ultimate destruction of the governments and religions they were elected or appointed to serve. This happened in Yalta. You remember Yalta? FDR went over. We gave away the world to them. This has happened time and time again. The next point I find very interesting, and how true it is today. The Illuminati were to obtain control of the press and all other agencies which distribute information to the public. News and information was to be slanted so the Goyams would come to believe that a one-world government is the only solution to our many and varied problems. True today, isn't it? And again, I'm going to deal with that a little later on in this first 2 hours of the lecture. Going down here, a German author named Zwack put Weissaup's revised vision of the old age conspiracy into book form and named it Ein Original Skripten. My German isn't too good, even though I have a little bit of German in me. In 1784, a copy of this document was sent to the illuminist Weishaupt and delegated to foment the French Revolution. Mean the Illuminati was responsible for the French Revolution? Yes, absolutely. The courier was struck dead by lightning as he rode through Ratisbon on his way from Frankfurt to Paris. What about a little divine intervention there, huh? The police found the subversive documents on his body and turned them over to the proper government authorities. After careful study of the plot, the Bavarian government ordered the police to raid Weissaupt's newly organized lodges of the Grand Orient and the homes of some of the most influential associates, including the castle of Baron Bossen-Sonderdorf. Additional evidence thus obtained convinced the authorities the documents were a genuine copy of a conspiracy by which the Synagogue of Satan had controlled the Illuminati at the top, planned to use wars and revolutions to bring about the establishment of one kind or another of a one-world government, the powers of which they intended to usurp as soon as it was established. In 1785, the Bavarian government outlawed the Illuminati and closed the lodges of the Grand Orient. In 1786, they published the details of the conspiracy. I find that very interesting, and I think that we can now go on to some more specific goals, as mentioned. This appears also in this Pawns in the Game. In 1773, when Meyer Rothschild was only 30 years of age, he invited 12 other wealthy and influential men to meet him in Frankfurt. His purpose was to convince them that if they agreed to pool their resources, they could then finance and control the world revolutionary movement and use it as their manual of action to win ultimate control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the world. After the general introduction to build up an enthusiastic reception for the plot, he was about to unfold, Rothschild turned to a manuscript and proceeded to read a carefully prepared plan of action. The following is what I have, this is the author, what I have been assured is a condensed version of the plot by which the conspirators hope to obtain ultimate, undisputed control of the wealth, natural resources, and manpower of the entire world. 1. The speaker started to unfold the plot by saying that because the majority of men are inclined to evil rather than to good, the best results in governing them could be obtained by using violence and terrorism and not by academic discussions. The speaker reasoned that in the beginning, human society had been subject to brutal and blind force, which was afterwards changed to law. He argued that law was force only to disguise. He reasoned it was logical to conclude that by the laws of the nature, right lies in force. Next point. He next asserted that political freedom is an idea and not a fact. He stated that in order to usurp political power, all that was necessary was to preach liberalism so that the electorate, for the sake of an idea, would yield some of their power and prerogatives, which the plotters could then gather together into their own hands. Do we have a little liberalism in this country today? Of course. 3, the speaker asserted that the power of gold had usurped the power of liberal rulers even then in 1773. He reminded his audience that there had been a time when faith had ruled, but stated that once freedom had been substituted for faith, the people did not know how to use it in moderation. He argued that because of this fact, it was logical to assume that they could use the idea of freedom to bring about class wars. He pointed out that it was immaterial to the success of his plan whether the established governments were destroyed by internal or external forces, because the victor had of necessity to seek the aid of capital, which is entirely in our hands. Number 4, he argued that the use of any and all means to reach their final goal was justified on the grounds that the ruler who governed by the moral code was not a skilled politician because he left himself vulnerable and is in unsuitable position to his throne. He said, those who wish to rule must have recourse to cunning and to make-believe, because great national qualities like frankness and honesty are vices in politics. I think that kind of applies to Washington, D.C. right today. Number 5, he asserted our right lies in force. The word right is an abstract thought and proves nothing. I find a new right to attack by the right of the strong and to scatter to the winds all existing forces of order and regulations, to reconstruct all existing institutions. And to become the sovereign lord of all those who left for us the rights to their powers by laying them down voluntarily in their liberalism. 6, he then admonished his listeners with these words: the power of our resources must remain invisible until the very moment when it has gained such strength that no cunning or force can undermine it. He warned them that any deviation from the line of the strategy plan he was making known to them would risk bringing to naught the labors of the century. The powers of our resources must remain invisible. What's going on in America today? Their plot, their plans, their conspiracy remains invisible. Nobody in a position of authority seems to be worried about it. It's only us who are Goyans that are concerned about it, right? The mass of the people. We do have an opportunity, fortunately, through the alternate press, to learn about these things, and through lectures such as we have here today. Number 7, he next advocated the use of mob psychology to obtain control of the masses. He reasoned that the might of the mob is blind, senseless, and unreasoning, and ever at the mercy of suggestion from any side. He stated only a despotic ruler can rule the mob efficiently, because without absolute despotism, there can be no existence for civilization, which was carried out not by the masses, but by their guide, whosoever that person might be. He warned, the moment the mob seizes freedom in their hands, it quickly turns to anarchy. Number 8, he next advocated that the use of alcohol, liquor, drugs, moral corruption, and all forms of vice be used systematically by their agenteurs to corrupt the morals of the youth in the nation. He recommended that the special agenteurs should be trained as tutors, lackeys, governesses, clerks, and by our women in the places of dissipation frequented by the Goyans. He added, in the number of these last, I count also the so-called society ladies who become voluntary followers of the others in corruption and luxury. We must not stop at bribery, deceit, and treachery when they should serve towards the attainment of our ends. Well, what about the youth today? What about drugs today? What about corruption of the morals of our youth? The CIA is the biggest drug dealer in America, has been for years, starting back in the 1960s, okay? Going on. By the way, speaking of drugs, let me just mention, there's a recent article in Reader's Digest. In fact, it was January 1996. And here's what it says. In 1993, some 6 tons of heroin, 200 tons of cocaine, and 3,900 tons of marijuana crossed the Mexican border into the United States. Now, this is just what's crossed the Mexican border. This doesn't count what came into Mena, Arkansas. The Mena, Arkansas drug operation was $100 million a month operation for 10 years when Clinton was governor there. By the way, Larry Nichols, who was marketing director of the Arkansas Development Finance Authority, which was used as the device for laundering the drug money and for making the loans, told Bill Clinton, according to Larry Nichols, that we had this big drug operation going, and Clinton told him, hey, that's a federal problem. Now that he's president, I guess maybe it's a state problem. But for those of you who are not familiar with the Mena, Arkansas situation, the Arkansas Development Finance Authority was established in order to provide money, loans to schools, churches, and students. And instead, it was used to launder money from the Mena drug operation. And in that particular operation, they were flying arms out and drugs in. And Bill Clinton himself personally signed off on each loan. The loans were not repaid in many instances. In some instances, they didn't even make one payment. And Don Tyson, according to Clinton Chronicles, number 2, himself took a $10 million loan from there and never paid it back. So we're talking about just the Mexican border here. We're not talking about what was flown in and out of this country. We're not talking about what's coming over from the Canadian border now. And my confidential sources tell me that there's extensive drug operations coming in from Canada. Now, stop and think about this. There's an extensive amount of corruption in the state of Nebraska. There's no question about it. My sources in Montana tell me that there's an extensive amount of drugs and corruption with officials in that state. It makes a lot of sense, and it's much easier to corrupt a state with a few small population rather than with a large population like New York and California. So I think that's what we're looking at, and that would also include, of course, Arkansas. Now, according to these statistics are estimates by the White House Office of the National Drug Control Policy. Now, bear in mind, there was 1993, 6 tons of heroin, 200 tons of cocaine, and 3,900 tons of marijuana. I've already said that once. Now, yet that year, Customs confiscated from trucks, tankers, and vans less than 9 tons of marijuana, 4 tons of cocaine, and no heroin. So we're talking about corruption? Yes. Corruption at the highest level. Now, I have some sources, some confidential sources who furnish me information from time to time. And there's code words for some of these various operations. The code word that I'm going to tell you about right now, and this is in my source's own handwriting. He doesn't write too well, so I may make some mistakes. The Black Rose is a code word for this. It's a clandestine group of U.S. government operatives, primarily the CIA, which has for many years run illegal drugs and arms operations in both Southeast Asia via the Golden Triangle and the Middle East via the Golden Crescent, funded by the British socialist-based Russell Trust drug cartel. The Black Rose's current chairman and co-founder is an individual known as the White Rose, or GHWB, a known bisexual pedophile and CFR, Council on Foreign Relations conspirator. This man, as a top member of the Skull and Bones Society, developed the heroin ring, which, while servicing as ambassador, along with his CIA activities. The Black Rose also runs cocaine through Panama from Colombia to the offshore oil rigs in the Gulf of Mexico. That's directly from a government agent. Now, we mentioned Vietnam. In the McDonald case that I described to you earlier, the motive for the cover-up, and I waited until now to tell you about this. Helena Stokely told me that the reason for the cover-up was because her Satanic Code drug group were bringing drugs in from the base that had been flown in plastic bags in the body cavities of the dead GIs from Vietnam in Air Force planes, CIA planes. They were bringing the drugs off the base and distributing them up and down the East Coast. And they went in on their own, wiped out the McDonald family, without the knowledge of the higher-ups in the drug operation, which included some top Army personnel, some police officers, 2 attorneys in Fayetteville. And the higher-ups were afraid that if there was an investigation of Alina Stokely's satanic cult group, it could expose the whole operation. You want documentation on drugs being flown in plastic bags in the body cavities of the dead GIs? Look at Time Magazine, January 1, 1973. I mentioned Mena, Arkansas, drugs. By the way, there's been so much heat placed on Mena, Arkansas, that they've shifted their operation for this drug activity to Biloxi, Mississippi. I mentioned the laundering of money on the Mena, Arkansas case. They were laundering their money through the Arkansas Development Finance Authority into a BCCI bank in Atlanta, Georgia, and one in Florida. And they also laundered their money in Ross Stankowski's bank in Chicago. Beg your pardon? That's right. I'm sorry. That's right. We're not supposed to have questions, are we? Okay. Now let's talk about the next point here, item number 9. Turning to politics, he claimed that they had the right to seize property by any means and without hesitation, if by doing so they secured submission and sovereignty. He pronounced our state marching along the path of peaceful conquest has the right to replace the horrors of war by less noticeable and more satisfactory sentences of death necessary to maintain the terror, which tends to produce blind submission. I gave a speech just a few nights ago for the Prophecy Club in Wichita, 2 nights ago, as a matter of fact. And a farmer came up afterwards, told me about his problem, and I'm sure that some of you here may have the same problem. He was granted some loans by the bank, and he was making his payments. He had a little problem for a short period of time, but he felt like he could catch up on it, and he recalled the whole note. Now he's in the process of losing his farm. It's been in the family for 5 generations. This is tragic, and this is happening to farmer after farmer after farmer. I don't know if those of you who are familiar with the Gordon Call case out of North Dakota. IRS came in. They were going to take his land away from him, his farm away from him. He had a shootout with the U.S. Marshals on the highway. His son, Yori, was shot and is presently serving life in the penitentiary right now. I'm glad to report that Yori's attorney is John DeCamp from Lincoln, Nebraska, who's also worked with the Nebraska Franklin cover-up case. John's a wonderful man and a great attorney, and I've been working with John, as I mentioned, since the late 1980s. But Gordon Call had to go into hiding in Arkansas, and he was ultimately murdered by the marshals. And the sheriff who went in with the marshals, according to information I have, made the statement after they shot him, "Oh, you shot the wrong man," and then the sheriff ended up dead. I can't say that somebody shot him or didn't shoot him, but I know he ended up dead. The house ended up being burned down. For those of you who are familiar with Dianne Feinstein, the senator from California, she's introduced a bill about taking the national parks and taking the state land and county land and turning it over to the federal government. There is an organization in the government itself known as the International Biosphere Reserves. The New World Order, this is again from one of my sources, for section of land, the New World Order term for section of land that has been turned over to the World Conservation Bank, that's the World WCB, in lieu of payments of the debt of the International Monetary Fund or the World Bank. It's called the International Biosphere Reserves. In the U.S., largely unknown by most Americans, many beautiful national parks and wilderness areas are quietly being turned over to the world bankers, the Rothschilds, Rockefeller cartel, as payment on the national debt. Areas such as the Smoky Mountain National Park, these are then cleared of any citizens and zealously patrolled by the U.S. Forestry Service. This is going on today, and as a matter of fact, of the 98 federal parks in this country, the United Nations has control of 47 of them. There is an agency, a little-known agency in the Treasury Department. It's called the Financial Crimes Enforcement Network. It's a little-known agency whose subversive mission is to monitor every dime you earn, track every dollar you spend, and identify all your assets and property for later confiscation. Let's go on to number 10. Dealing with the use of the slogans, he said, in ancient times we were the first to put the words liberty, equality, and fraternity into the mouths of the masses, words repeated to this day by stupid poll parrots, words which the would-be wise men of the Goyams could make nothing of in their abstractness and did not note the contradiction of their meaning and interrelation. He claimed the words brought under their directions and control legions who bore out our banners with enthusiasm. He reasoned that there is no place in nature for equality, liberty, or fraternity. He said, on the ruins of the natural and genealogical aristocracy of the Goyams, we have set up the aristocracy of money. Qualification for this aristocracy is wealth, which is dependent upon us. Well, let's look at wealth. Where's the wealth of this country today? Federal Reserve, right? And where does the money collected from the IRS go? Goes to the Federal Reserve. Doesn't go toward paying the national debt. And from the Federal Reserve System, which is a private held stock corporation, it goes into the World Bank. And the banks are in London, Switzerland, Rome, Paris, and so forth. These are the people that run the world. These are the Illuminati. Very simple. The most recent information on money, and this has been documented, is that there's $1 billion per day in $100 bills that's being shipped out of Kennedy Airport by Delta Airlines to Russia. $1 billion per day in $100 bills, 5 days a week. And for those of you who are not too familiar with the Federal Reserve System, I'm sure some of you do know this. I know most of you probably do. This is a well-educated group, obviously. The Federal Reserve asks the U.S. Treasury to print up $100 bills. The U.S. Treasury charges the Federal Reserve 2.3 cents per bill. And then the Federal Reserve takes that money that they have that came right out of the sky, right from the Treasury Department, and they loan it out. That plus principal and interest. Let's go on now to number 11. He then expounded his theories regarding war. In 1773, he set down a principle which the government of Britain and the United States publicly announced as their joint policy in 1939. Don't you find that interesting? Set down policy. He set down a principle that was announced by our government and the British in 1939. I find that fascinating. He said it should be the policy of those present to foment wars, but to direct the peace conference so that neither of the combatants obtain territorial gains. He said the war should be directed so that the nations engaged on both sides should be placed further in our debt and in the power of our agentures. Yalta again. We gave away, we basically won. What did they do to Patton? You remember what they did to Patton? He wanted to keep right on going. He was told by the president, stop. By the way, are you aware of the fact that we left, our government left, between 35 and 50,000 GIs in Russia after World War II? I'm sure you're aware of the MIA POW issue in the Vietnam. Okay? General Patton wanted to go after them. It was shortly after he said he was going to go into Russia and rescue our boys that he died in an automobile accident. Well, at least he wasn't Arkansas-ed. Okay, next. Number 12. He then dealt with administration. He told those present that they must use their wealth to have candidates chosen for public office who would be servile and obedient to our commands so they may readily be used as pawns in our game by learned and ingenious men we will appoint to operate behind the scenes of government as official advisors. He added, the men we appoint as advisors will have been bred, reared, and trained from childhood in accordance with our ideas to rule the affairs of the whole world. I find this very interesting. They will have been bred, reared, and trained from childhood in accordance with our ideas to rule the affairs of the whole world. Now, I have, in my experience in developing information about satanic movement in this country, I've talked to a lot of people. An example of this, number 12, being born bred. I was contacted by a lady attorney in New York City. She was a multi-generation Satanist. You remember I told you that's somebody that's been raised, born into the family. Grandfather, grandmother, mother, father, etc. She told me that she was raised by her family. She knew well in advance that she was going to be an attorney, and she was sent to law school, and her specialty was immigration laws. And she would go to Europe and bring children into this country that she didn't know, land at Kennedy Airport in New York City, turn these children over, usually one child at a time, and she was a specialist on immigration, so she knew what to do in Europe in order to get their hands on this child. Bring the child in, turn it over to a man, two men, in Kennedy Airport she'd never met before, and walk away. She was supposedly bringing the child in for adoption. I've seen case after case of history where people were specifically assigned and born and reared and trained for assignments in this area. Have you ever heard of presidential models? Presidential models are sex slaves for some of the top people in the government. There's a woman named Kathy O'Brien who's recently written a book on this. I happen to know of another lady who was a presidential model. And what they do, and these ladies were born for that purpose. In fact, one of them was born on Eisenhower's inauguration. And they're trained, mind control, MK Ultra, Project Monarch, these are CIA mind control programs. They're trained specifically for an assignment. In this particular assignment, she told me, the one lady told me that she was molested on a regular basis by her father, and he still loved her, however. And when she was 16, he came in, and he was crying in her bedroom. He said, "My dear, I've got to give you up." And he passed her on to some training for training with a group of men. She later ended up with some of the top politicians in the country, presidents. I'm talking about presidents. This has been confirmed by two individuals I've talked to, Kathy O'Brien and another one. The other one wishes to remain anonymous. And I understand there are three other ladies who fall in this category. They've all gotten out, and it's just like the children that they use for victims of pedophile. When they get so old, they let them out, push them out into the street. Okay, item number 13. He dealt with propaganda that explained how their combined wealth could control all outlets of public information while they remained in the shade and clear of blame, regardless of what the repercussions might be due to the publication of libels, slander, or untruths. The speaker said, "Thanks to the press, we've got gold in our hands, notwithstanding the fact that we had to gather it out of the oceans of blood and tears. But it has paid us even though we have sacrificed many of our own people. Each victim on our side is worth 1,000 goyams." Well, don't you find that interesting? We're talking about propaganda. We're talking about the press, outlets of public information. I don't know how many of you are aware, but I recently ran for President of the United States. And in November, late November, I was sitting in my living room. I don't sit very often. I usually am working. But I was watching the politicians. And I said to myself, these people have missed the point. They either are totally ignorant or they don't know what they're talking about. But these people, these men are running for President of the United States. They haven't really addressed the real issues. The real issues are what we're talking about here today. These are the issues. Not, I'm going to go back to Washington, D.C. and make this all a bed of roses. And as far as I'm concerned, there's not a dime's worth of difference between the Democrats or the Republicans. They've both been compromised. And these kids that were taken back to Washington, D.C., they weren't taken back just for Democrats, and they weren't taken back just for Republicans. There were Republicans and Democrats there. But anyway, I got mad. I had $164.31 in the bank, and I said, I'm going to run for President of the United States. And I did. I thought about it, and I said, well, I've been a Republican all my life. Should I run as a Republican, or maybe I should go over and register Democrat for the first time my whole life and run against the real problem, Bill Clinton? So I did. I registered Democrat, and I was, there's some good Democrats, good conservative Democrats, I'm sure. Someplace, I don't know where they are, but they're someplace. But anyway, then I formed a group, committee to elect Ted Gunderson, and we did raise a few dollars. The first check I received was for $1,000, and I used that $1,000 to register in New Hampshire. And I got on the ballot in New Hampshire, and then I was able to raise another $2,500, and I was able to get on the ballot in Texas. And then I raised another $500, and I sent it to Colorado, and with my $500, I met the deadlines, filled out the application, and I received a response back about 10 days later, 2 weeks later. I'm sorry, you're not a viable candidate, and they kept my $500. I tried to get on the ballot in Oregon and Tennessee. They said, you're not a viable candidate, forget it. Anyway, to make a long story short, I had, in addition to my experiences dealing with the media, this deals with number 13, dealing with the media as an FBI agent, I dealt with them as a politician. I mean, really, let's face it, I'm not really a politician, right? But it was fun. And I recall that I was campaigning in Texas. I did manage to get to Texas. I didn't manage to get to New Hampshire. My money was real short. But a man came in. He liked my platform, strictly downsize the federal government, do away with the IRS, go back to the 17th Amendment, you know, states' rights, and so forth. The man came in. He said, look, he said, I'd like to support you. And I said, fine. You know, I need all the support I can get. He said, no, financially. I said, fine, but you can only give me $1,000 unless you put a political action committee together and you give me $5,000. He said, no. He says, I'll tell you what we'll do. We'll go on a joint venture, and I'll invest some money, and you come in and be a business partner with me. I said, that's great. So I thought I was going to have some money, and so I called on February the 9th. I called a television station in New Hampshire. I called WMUR, ABC TV, Manchester, New Hampshire. And I said, look, I'm Ted Gunderson. I'm a presidential candidate, and I had a committee to elect, and I'd registered with the Federal Election Commission. And I want to run Clinton Chronicles this Sunday night, or a week from Sunday night. And what will 2 hours prime time cost me? Now, I thought I was going to have the money, because this man said, well, I'll bring $750,000 in. I'm going to bring it in from overseas. And I thought he was legit. As it is, I think he was a government plant, but that's beside the point. But anyway, I thought I was going to have the money. So, you know, bear in mind, as a politician, the only way they can turn me down as a candidate, a viable candidate, is if there's sex or drugs involved in the video or the show. Well, there's drugs involved, certainly, and sex involved, but it's not by me, right? I mean, it's a documentary. So they said $20,000. And I talked to a woman named Julie Campesino. Call back Monday. Hi, Julie, this is Ted. Yes, I remember. Oh, by the way, I checked, and I was wrong on the price for 2 hours of prime time. It's $120,000. So it went up $100,000. I was scheduled in New Hampshire to be on a forum, and I was canceled. And I had a feeling I was supposed to be on a forum on Friday morning. Before I got on the plane, I thought I better call. I called, and they said, well, you're not, you know, you were scheduled, but you're not going to be on there. I had an opportunity to talk at Branch Davidian rally on the state capitol building in Texas, Austin, Texas, on a Saturday morning. And I was the last speaker. There were 4 speakers. And they were filming all 3 of them before I got up. And when I got up to talk, the CBS closed down and walked away. So we're talking about the press, control of the press. Now, in New Hampshire, when the final ballot was in, by the way, I ended up 12th out of 21 candidates there. And in Texas, I was able to come up with 15,501 votes. And half of those votes were from the Christian Station TV show that I did in Houston, Texas. And so it shows you the power of television. But in New Hampshire, when the final tally came in for the Democratic primary, the press reported that Bill Clinton had 94% of the votes, and the rest of us had 6%. Well, I went behind the scenes, and I found out that what happened was Bill Clinton actually had 91%, and 3% of the voters submitted a blank ballot. That was never reported in the press. In Iowa, there was, in one instance, there was 13% of the votes were taken away from Buchanan. And what happened was the precinct captains reported the information to the media before he gave it to the electorates. And they reported it and put it out as official news. By the way, in the Nebraska case, this is a typical example of controlling the press. Yorkshire Television out of England came into Lincoln and Omaha and did a 10-month TV documentary of the case. They talked to Paul Benassi, Alicia Owens, and by the way, the kids told me that there were victims. Young children were being transported from Omaha to Des Moines, to Milwaukee, to Madison, back to Minneapolis. They were being victimized by some of the leading men in all of these various communities, leading businessmen. But Yorkshire Television came in. We couldn't, John could not get an American organization or corporation or American studio or film production company to do anything here, so he went to England. They worked for 10 months. They put together a TV documentary. It's called Conspiracy in Silence. On May the 4th, 1994, it was to be aired. 2 weeks before it was to be aired, on the Discovery Channel. Discovery Channel was purchased by Cox Television, and the show was killed. Cox Television out of Atlanta, Georgia. One of the major stockholders in Cox Television, according to John DeCamp, is George Bush. I find that very interesting. Now, there was an article recently in the Las Vegas Review-Journal. And since I happen to live in Las Vegas, I happen to have noticed this, but I've seen this on a number of other occasions. It's dated April 3, 1996. This article deals with the Freeman. The Freeman's beliefs are described as the headlines. I got mad not too long ago when I heard Brandy Schweitzer, Leroy Schweitzer's daughter, was claiming that her father was being tortured by the U.S. Marshal. I jumped on a plane and flew to Montana to find out for myself. I interviewed Brandy Schweitzer and Scott Schweitzer, and I interviewed another individual who saw Leroy Schweitzer, the head of the Freeman Group, in Montana the day that he was arraigned, and he had a 1.5-inch gash on his cheek, and I took statements from these people on camera. And so I do have a little bit of first-hand knowledge. I've also interviewed a number of people who have attended the school. And in fact, Jeremiah Television is doing a video on it, and I'm helping them in that regard. I just want to read this to you. But after a week of being confined to the snow-covered ranch, watched by federal agents who have a direct telephone line to the ranch compound, the Freemen are showing signs of leaning more heavily on the racist Christian identity teachings that form the basis of their politics. It's very frightening, said Eric Ward, Associate Director of the Northwest Coalition Against Malicious Harassment. Sometimes I wonder who's being harassed, by the way. The Seattle-based human rights group is well known in the region for keeping track of neo-Nazis, white supremacists, and other fringe groups. They believe there's a world conspiracy that has signaled them out and that satanic powers will be turned against them, Ward said. It creates the idea of being crusaders or even martyrs for the cause. The Christian identity movement holds that white people from Northern Europe are God's chosen, while Jews are the offspring of Satan and blacks are subhuman, quote, mud people, end quote. This theory may be the backbone of the Freemen's efforts to set up their own government. Notice it said may be, right? To set up their own government and claim America for, quote, true citizens. It's like a cult, Ward said. These are people who have isolated themselves from the rest of society. There's no moderating influence. They're feeding on one another's fears and paranoia. That becomes an explosive situation for those who have to deal with this group. I've asked everybody I've interviewed who's attended that school, I've asked them about this article, and they said, Not true. Not true. That's how the media, the news is slanted. Now, I'd like to read, in conclusion with number 13, I'd like to read from an article that appeared in Operation Vampire Killer 2000. Some of you may have already seen this. And here's what it says. David Rockefeller, international billionaire, humanist, CFR, Council on Foreign Relations kingpin, founder of the Trilateral Commission, world order godfather, and in all probability the high school graduated voted most likely to be hanged for treason. I didn't say that. Voiced his praise of the control of the U.S. media for keeping their oath not to divulge the globist plans to the public. Speaking to his fellow conspirators at a meeting of yet one more infamous world order group, the Bilderbergers, Mr. Rockefeller said, by the way, I have a book that's available. You talk about control of the media, control of the press. It's called Who's Who of the Elite. And if you're interested in this book, I'll be glad to make it available to you. I'll just have to give you the information. My address will appear, by the way, on this video at the end. And if I can't come up with it, I'll make sure that the Prophecy Club has it available to them if you want to get it from them. But this book is Who's Who of the Elite. This names the members of the Trilateral, current members and past members, the Council on Foreign Relations, the Committee of 300, the Bilderbergers, Skull and Bones, and then it breaks them down. It points out the number that are working in the TV media. It points out the number that are working in universities. There's a lot of them in the universities, folks. It points out the number that are working in the publishing business and the number that work in the print media. I don't have those figures with me, but it's amazing and astounding how many that there are. And that's your control of the media. Anyway, continuing. This is what Rockefeller, according to Operation Vampire Killer 2000, this is what Rockefeller told the Bilderbergers. We are grateful to the Washington Post, the New York Times, Time Magazine, and other great publications whose directors have attended our meetings and respected their promise of discretion for almost 40 years. He went on to explain, it would have been impossible for us to develop our plan for the world if we had been subject to the bright lights of publicity during those years. But the world is now more sophisticated and prepared to march towards a world government. The supernatural sovereignty of an intellectual elite and world bankers is surely preferable to the national autodetermination practiced in past centuries. And then it goes on, that's the end of the quote. It is not reported if the attendees kissed his ring or anything else after their leader bestowed his blessing on those in attendance. Actually, we could ask Governor Clinton or Dan Quayle, both of whom were there. Bush and Clinton are Bilderbergers, internationalists, and their goals are exactly the same for America. Let us repeat. Clinton's, Bush's, Perot's plans for America are virtually identical. The Republican, the Democrats' goal for America are virtually identical. They both are taking our nation into global government. Globalist Mr. Dan Quayle was there in the June 1991 meeting, being sized up as a possible Bilderberger U.S. presidential contender in 1996. The major media's job is to convince Americans that the Republicans and the Democrats are on opposite sides and fighting each other. Interesting. Okay, number 14. He then explained the necessity of having their agenteur always come into the open and appear on the scene when conditions had reached their lowest ebb and the masses have been subjected by means of want and terror. He pointed out that when it was time to restore order, they should do it in such a way that the victims would believe that they had been the prey of criminals and irresponsibles. He said, by executing the criminals and lunatics after they have carried out our preconceived reign of terror, we can make ourselves appear as the saviors of the oppressed and the champions of the workers. The speaker then added, we are interested in just the opposite, in the denudation, the killing out of the Goyans. I have received information, and I want to be very cautious about this. I cannot document this. It's strictly intelligence, raw intelligence information, so I don't put it out as a fact. But if it's true, it's something to be concerned about. that weapons are being given to gangs in this country, gangs that are distributing drugs, men on the street, and that these gangs are the ones that have been designated to shoot and eliminate police officers when the time comes. And then the Army or the New World Order or the military, whoever's going to be taking over eventually, will come in and eliminate the gangs. I also have information that the biggest concern of the New World Order is not the militia. That's all a facade. I'm afraid they could eliminate the militia as it stands today without too much difficulty, although there will be some people that will be difficult to locate and seek out. But the biggest concern they have is the veterans who have come back from the various services, particularly the Navy SEALs and the Special Forces. And I have been told, and I think this is accurate information, I don't want to put it out as a fact per se, because I have not seen paper on it, and I usually like to say this is so because I've seen the documentation. But I've been told that these are the men that they're concerned about, the New World Order is concerned about. These are the men who have already had others assigned for assassination. In other words, these are the ones that will be the first to be assassinated when the New World Order tries to take over. Okay, next. He next explained how industrial depressions and financial panics could be brought about and used to serve their purpose, saying enforced unemployment and hunger imposed on the masses because of the power we have to create shortages of food will create the right of capital to rule more surely than it was given to the real aristocracy and by the legal authority of kings. He claimed that by having their agentur control the mob, and the mob could then be used to wipe out all who dare to stand in their way. Number 15, financial panic, right? Food shortage. What about the savings and loan? You remember the savings and loan when they deregulated savings and loan? Millions of people lost their money, their life's savings. Right up here in Lincoln, Nebraska, Commonwealth Savings and Loan was written up and on 60 Minutes over that. There's organizations that advocate right today the reduction of the world population. They're actively advocating that. Warren Buffett, the richest man in America, on and off with another gentleman, depending on how much stock they bought the day before, and has been identified by the kids in the Nebraska case as being present at some of the meetings that were held. Warren Buffett is very active in this organization to reduce the world population. It's been alleged that the AIDS epidemic was actually started by the government. And then we have more recently this, the HARP program. For those of you who do not have this book, it is available through the Prophecy Club. Angels Don't Play This Harp, Advances in Tesla's Technology. The HARP program. U.S. government has a new ground-based Star Wars weapon which is being tested in the remote bush country of Alaska. This new system manipulates the environment in a way which can disrupt human mental processes, jam all global communication systems, change weather patterns over large areas, that's happening right today, interfere with wildlife migration patterns, negatively affect your health, unnaturally impact the Earth's upper atmosphere. The U.S. military calls its Zapper HARP, High Frequency Active Auroral Research Program, but this Skybuster is not about the northern lights. This device will turn on lights never intended to be artificially manipulated. It's all explained in this book. It's available, I think, back here today. Looking at the Gulf War illness, the British troops and the American troops who were vaccinated, 440,000 of them, they were the ones that became ill, not the other troops who were not vaccinated. Looking at the food shortage, people said, oh, there's no food shortage. I have an article here, June 12, 1995, Spotlight Magazine. During the last 18 months, the government has been storing hundreds of tons of grain and other foodstuffs in some 50 secret underground facilities around the country. There are certain grain shortages areas that are empty on a regular basis to the extent that there's hardly any grain available for the general public. Look at, let's go on to the next item. Oops. I'm not doing so well, am I? Oops. Let's see. Okay. We talked about financial panics and so forth, depression, financial problems. The infiltration into continental Freemasonry was next discussed extensively. The speaker stated that their purpose would be to take advantage of the facilities and secrecy Freemasonry had to offer. He pointed out that they could organize their own Grand Orient lodges within Blue Masonry in order to carry on their subversive activities and hide the true nature of their work under the cloak of philanthropy. He stated that all members initiated into their Grand Orient lodges should be used to politicize purposes and for spreading their atheistic, materialistic ideology amongst the Goyans. He ended this phase of the discussion with the words, "When the hour strikes for our sovereign Lord of all the world to be crowned, these same hands will sweep away everything that might stand in their way." Number 17, he next expounded the value of systematic deception, pointing out that their agentur should be trained in the use of high-sounding phrases and the use of popular slogans. They should make the masses the most lavish of promises. He observed the opposite of what has been promised can always be done afterwards, that is, of no consequences. He reasoned that by using such words as freedom and liberty, the Goyams could be stirred up to such a pitch and patriotic fever that they could be made to fight even against the laws of God and nature. He added, and for this reason, after we obtain control of the very name of God, we'll be erased from the lexicon of life. He then detailed the plans for revolutionary war, the art of street fighting, and outlined the pattern of the reign of terror, which he insisted must accompany every revolutionary effort, because it is the most economical way to bring the population to a speedy subjection. Well, we have most recently here Janet Reno, among other things, once a national hit team, February 27, 1995. You find it interesting that she is talking about using U.S. military units as well as personnel from all the federal agencies, the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms, drug enforcement agencies, and I'm sure the FBI, yes, the FBI. And in fact, under the proposed new act, the Rapid Deployment Strike Force would be commanded by Deputy Assistant Director of the FBI and would be staffed by not only FBI agents, but through the transfer of personnel from their elites and entities into the Department of Justice or any other federal agency. So, we have there a direct contradiction and violation of the posse comitatus. I might mention that it's been documented that the military and civilian law enforcement agencies, federal agencies, have had a series of joint training sessions in Michigan and in Arizona in house-to-house training. House-to-house training of going in and searching the houses and taking over a facility. Well, let's see, what was that last question? That was number 18. Number 19. Diplomacy was next discussed. After all wars, secret diplomacy must be insisted upon in order that our agentur, masquerading as political, financial, economic advisors, can carry out our mandates without fear of exposing who are the secret power behind the national and international affairs. The speaker then told those present that by secret diplomacy they must obtain such control that the nation cannot come to even an inconceivably private agreement without our secret agents being on hand. Number 20, the ultimate world government is the goal. To reach this goal, the speaker told them it will be necessary to establish huge monopolies, reservoirs of such colossal riches that even the largest fortunes of the Goyams will depend on us to such an extent that they will go to the bottom together with the credit of their government on the day after the great political smash. The speaker then added, you gentlemen here present who are economists just strike an estimate of the significance of this combination. Well, I think you may recall, since you are a well-educated group, about the meeting in San Francisco, September 27th to October 1st, Plans for Global Civilization. Gorbachev, Bush led the charge. It was chaired by Ted Turner. Margaret Thatcher was also there. Margaret Thatcher was the one person that said, no, I want to maintain sovereignty for Great Britain, for England. And she walked out on it. What about our people? Don't you think we deserve sovereignty? Of course we do. And now, in order to take over the world, or take over the country, you have to have certain situations which are in existence, and certain commands, and certain mandates, and a certain degree of power. And this is it right here. These are presently in order right now. Executive orders now in effect. Check them one against the Communist Manifesto. We'll turn over to the Communist Manifesto next. Now let me explain. Executive orders, this is unconstitutional, this whole thing right here. Because executive orders were designed to give directives to departmental heads within the government. In other words, the president can tell the director of the FBI, do this. He can tell the Department of Justice, Attorney General, do this. The Postmaster General, do this. Okay? Executive Order 10995 takes over all communications. Executive Order 10997 takes over all electric power, petroleum, gas, fuel, and minerals. Executive Order 10998 takes over all food resources and farms. Executive Order 10999 takes over all means of transportation, controls highways and seaports. Executive Order 11000 drafts all citizens into workforces under government supervision, slave laborers. Sounds like Nazi Germany to me. Executive Order 11001 takes over all health, welfare, and educational functions. We already have, what's the United Nations outcome education? And this is in many of our schools today, so they've already started in the educational functions. Executive Order 11002 empowers the Post Office General to register all citizens nationwide. They're probably already doing that through credit cards, and Social Security Administration. I'd say that's probably already in effect. Executive Order 11003 takes over all airports and aircraft. Executive Order 11004 takes over housing and finance authorities and housing designated as unsafe, establishes new locations for populations, builds new housing with public funds. Executive Order 11005 takes over railroads, inland waterways, and public storage facilities. Don't you find public storage facilities kind of a strange? And that's strange that they would say that. But I can certainly understand why, because they want to go after the guns, they want to go after the food. There is a new legislation. I heard it's been passed, but at least I can say without any question it's been proposed, that would limit the time limit that you have food on your shelf in your home. Yes. By the way, going back to HARP, I forgot to mention, one of the devices on HARP, that's the electronic high frequency in Alaska that we mentioned a few minutes ago. Any car that's been built the last 4 years has a computer chip in it. And HARP can freeze that car in place once they turn it on. They have the capability of doing that. In New Jersey, they recently passed a law that placed very high restrictions on the exhaust emission of automobiles. And it's been stated, and I have the records of this someplace, I don't have it with me here today, that most of the automobiles that are 10 years old and older will not be able to pass the emission test in New Jersey. And, of course, that would not include the automobiles that have been built in the last 4 years. Executive Order 11051 designates the responsibilities of the Office of Emergency Planning, giving authorization to put the above orders into effect in times of increased international tension or economic crisis, anytime they want to do it, in other words. Then comes the big one, Executive Order 11490. All of the above orders are immediately activated. President John Kennedy at Columbia University in 1963 said it perfectly. The high office of the President has been used to foment a plot to destroy America's freedom, and before I leave this office, I must inform the citizens of their plight. 10 days later, he was dead. Communist Manifesto. The Communist Manifesto represents a misguided philosophy which teaches the citizens to give up the rights for the sake of the common good, but it also ends in a police state. This is called preventative justice. Control is the key concept. Read this carefully. Abolishment of private property. Heavy progressive income tax. Abolishment of all rights of inheritance. Confiscation of property for all immigrants and rebels. A central bank. Government control of communication and transportation. Government ownership of factories and agriculture. Government control of labor. Corporate farms, regional planning. By the way, to have corporate farms, you just about have to take over all the farms, don't you? Well, what are they doing in this country today? The big conglomerates are coming in and taking over the farms and the ranches when you can't meet your note in IRS, like in the Gordon Call case. Government control of education. Now let's look at. I took this out of the book recently. And these are, we're going back to the Illuminati now. We're going back 200 years. In a meeting on July the 16th, 1782, they set forth a 7-part goal. Order of chaos, abolition of private property, abolishment of inheritance, patriotism, all religion, abolishment of the family. What are they doing in this country today? Look at the moral fibers that are being destroyed through drugs. Drugs that are being brought into this country by government people. Creation of a new world order. 1782, a new world order. Number 21. Economic war. Plans to rob the Goyams of their landed properties and industries were then discussed. A combination of high taxes and unfair competition was advocated to bring about the economic ruin of the Goyim as far as their national financial interests and investments were concerned. In the international field, he felt that they could be encouraged to price themselves out of the markets. This could be the achievement, could be achieved by the careful control of raw materials, organized agitation amongst the workers for shorter hours and higher pay, and by subsidizing competitors. The speaker warned his co-conspirators that they must arrange matters and control conditions so that the increased wages obtained by the workers will not benefit them in any way. What's happening today? The price of cattle. Somebody told me that cattle in Texas is selling for 15 cents a pound. The feed is so high that they can't buy the feed, among other things. What about GATT and NAFTA, North American Free Trade? There's 16,400 Americans lose their jobs every day since GATT and NAFTA were passed. There's been over 800,000 people who've lost their jobs because of GATT and NAFTA. In the oil industry alone, from 1986 to 1992, the number of operating oil rigs dropped from 4,000 to less than 650. Oil was being we were self-sustaining ourselves to a degree, and in lieu of the active oil wells, we have instead 15 super tankers that are bringing 15 million barrels of oil a day into Houston, Texas. Zapata Oil Company owns 5 of these super tankers. Zapata Oil Company is owned by the George Bush family. All the oil that we have in Alaska, I understand that There's been a strike in Alaska, and there's no question we could be self-sustaining just from the oil that's available to us in that state. Now, for the 26 years from 1946 to 1971, speaking of the America's economy, 1946 to 1971, for 26 years, the U.S. trade had a surplus of $98 billion. The economy grew from 4.8% per year. The national debt rose to $148 billion. For the next 23 years, from 1972 to 1994, the U.S. suffered a $1.6 trillion trade deficit, whereas we had a surplus of $98 billion before. The economy grew 3.8%. The federal debt soared at an annual rate of 3,200% per year, more than preceding 26, not per year, but the rate of 3,200% more than any preceding 26 years by $4.3 trillion. So we have, where do we leave off? Number 21, 22, armaments. It was suggested that the building up of armaments for the purpose of making the Goyim destroy each other should be launched at such a colossal scale that in the final analysis there will only be the masses of the proletariat left in the world, with the few millionaires devoted to our cause and police and soldiers sufficient to protect our interests. Number 23, the new order. Members of the one world government would be appointed by the director. He would pick men from among the scientists, the economists, the financiers, the industrialists, and from the millionaires, because in substance everything will be settled by the question of figures. Number 24, importance of youth. The importance of capturing the interest of youth was emphasized with the admonition that our agenteurs should infiltrate into all classes and levels of society and government for the purpose of fooling, bemusing, and corrupting the younger members of society by teaching them theories and principles we know to be false. Well, certainly we see that today in our youth. Look at the, when I was I remember when I was in grade school and junior high and high school, I never even heard of drugs. Now my granddaughter tells me in junior high that there's drugs all over the place. It's going more serious and more serious every day. Number 25, national and international laws should be changed, but should be used as they are to destroy the civilization of the Goyim, merely by twisting them into a contradiction of the interpretation which first masks the law and afterwards hides it altogether. Our ultimate aim is to substitute arbitration by law. The speaker then told his listeners, "You may think the Goyim will rise upon us with arms, but in the West we have against this possibility an organization of such appalling terror that the very stoutest hearts quail. The underground, the metropolitans, the subterranean corridors, these will be established in the capitals and cities of all the counties before that danger threatens." I have from a number of sources, these are confidential sources, that there are numerous underground facilities available to our adversaries throughout the United States. I have been told by a source that's reliable, a source that's involved in the intelligence community, that there is extensive city underground in the Las Vegas, Nevada area. I've also been told by reliable sources that there is a piece of equipment that will go through hard rock at the rate of, I think, 10 miles an hour. I'm not sure about how many miles an hour it'll go. And it'll spit this rock out, and you can drive a car or a train through it. I don't think there's any question about the underground subterranean efforts of this country. Going back to NAT and GAFTA, this is sent to me by an attorney, and the position statement: the so-called free trade under NAFTA and GATT is neither free nor fair. Free trade is newspeak for the subversive policy that was designed to destroy the American economy. It was hatched up by Harry Dexter White versus Frank Coe and Harold Glasser, mainlined by Senator George W. Malone on page 76. The Senate Finance Committee heard testimony on GATT that 32 nations favored tariff goods on goods which they exported to the United States. Every one of these nations had recently increased its tariffs on American goods. Now, one of them imposed the tariffs for the only admissible business reason there is, namely, to equalize the wage standards of living between two countries engaged in trade. That's mainline page 77. If a $10,000 American automobile is sold on the American market, $4,000 of that price is made up of taxes paid to support the government in the United States where that market is made possible. A Japanese car makes no such contribution to the American infrastructure. President Nixon explained it clearly. If we buy steel rail from England, they have the money and we have the rail. If we buy steel rail from ourselves, we have both the money and the rail. Allowing products that do not pay American taxes or American wages to plunder American markets destroys American jobs. American dollars are taken out of the American economy where the money creates more American products with American jobs. It is not building walls to protect the American economy from an anti-American policy that tears down American productivity and prosperity. That, ladies and gentlemen, I think fairly well documents the goals and aims of the New World Order. And then I would like to go on and describe some other activity that's taking place in this country. And by the way, before I forget, I need to tell you about a march, that's taking place right after the Republican convention out of San Diego. It's going to take place from, they're going to march from San Diego to Washington, D.C. It's being sponsored by an organization known as CALL, down at the bottom. See if this works down here. Here, CALL. And CALL is Citizens Against Legal Loopholes. You might be interested in contacting these people for a Liberty Weekend. They plan to have the rally in D.C., and the number there at the bottom is 619-755-9319. And the purpose of the rally and the march to Washington, D.C. is to attract attention and to alert people to the problems that we're having in this country today, and particularly as in regards to the Constitution of the United States. Now, continuing with the New World Order, I'd like to point out that in this newspaper article, August 27th, 1994, at the bottom, in Oklahoma City, this article asks for applicants for a new federal transfer center in Oklahoma City. And it was estimated that thousands of Oklahomans would apply for this job. The prison transfer center is designed to hold 1,400 inmates for a maximum of 10 days each. Officials anticipate the transfer center will remain in full capacity continuously. Why would we need a federal transfer center all of a sudden at full capacity, 1,400 every 10 days? That's over 50,000 transfers a year. I think something like 55,000. I talked to an ex-con recently, federal prisoner. He was in the federal prison at one time, not anymore. He told me that the federal prisoners are being used and being paid $5.50 a day to work at the abandoned military bases, and they are constructing concentration camps there. This is directly from the horse's mouth. Before George Bush left office, he signed a treaty with the United Nations. This is a document from the Army that I obtained through one of my sources. And it's called Bridge to America, Partnership States. And this treaty, which was not presented to Congress, and so therefore after 90 days it was not ratified by Congress. After 90 days it becomes law. This treaty designated foreign troops to serve in various capacities in each state in our country, the United States. For example, in Texas, it would be Czechoslovakian troops. And while the Czechoslovakian troops are occupying Texas, American troops will be occupying some countries overseas, certain countries overseas. California will be Ukrainian troops. Illinois, Polish troops. I don't see Kansas on there. I don't see Missouri. I see Alabama and Illinois. Poland. Illinois will be Polish troops. So, I don't know of those of you who are aware of this, but not too long ago it was proposed. The proposal for House Rule 666. They're pretty arrogant, aren't they? Was designed to allow police officers more leeway in searching suspects and properties, according to a summary prepared by a House subcommittee. H.R. 666 would legislatively expand the good faith exceptions to situations where law enforcement officials gather evidence without a warrant. In other words, if a police officer believes he or she has a good reason to search you or your property, he can. Conservatives have long argued correctly that too many criminals exploit technicalities to beat the rap. On the other hand, critics have pointed out correctly that the Fourth Amendment protects all Americans, including criminals, from illegal, unconstitutional search and seizure. What an officer feels is irrelevant where the Constitution has been violated. A legislative advocate of the Civil Liberties Union, I don't know how you pronounce that, TAFA, I guess, the Civil Liberties Union, National Capital Area, told the Spotlight, this is just a new excuse to violate the Constitution. All of this hullabaloo is that law enforcement officers want separate rights, she added. Who will police the police? Apparently, some congressmen wanted to know the exact same thing. For example, Democratic amendments to the bill excluded agents of the Internal Revenue Service and the Bureau of Alcohol and Tobacco and Firearms from rule. Representative Jim Traficant, Democrat Ohio, introduced the IRS exclusion, and Representative Harold Volkmer, a Democrat Missouri, insisted the BATF abide by the Fourth Amendment. They are the biggest abusers of the rights of the gun owners and private citizens, Volkmer said. They're like a Rambo operation, and people here are realizing that. Representative Joseph Serrano, Democrat New York, introduced an amendment to have the Immigration Naturalization Service excluded. It was defeated 330 to 103. The real danger of House Rule 666 lies in the attitude of Republicans, where when Representative Melvin Watt, Democrat North Carolina, proposed replacing language in the bill with language very similar to the Fourth Amendment, the House voted 303 to 121 against his amendment. Representative Bill McCollum, Republican Florida, the bill's sponsor, said the language would gut the bill. Several Republicans agreed with him on the record. What the Democrats weren't telling anyone is the Democratic-controlled houses of the 101st and 102nd Congress passed bills aimed at doing the same thing, possibly penning citizens to unconstitutional warrantless searches, according to the subcommittee report. This bill, I understand, is not passed. It was proposed. I don't know how many of you are aware of a survey. This was, again, by Spotlight. By the way, I don't know if any of you take the Spotlight, but it's a very good alternative source, also Media Bypass. There's a publication, Contact, in Las Vegas that has some good information. And, but you... Oh, it did pass, okay. 666 did pass. The Spotlight has obtained a copy of the survey given to members of the U.S. Marine Corps asking, among other things, the willingness to serve in various capacities under the command of the United Nations. The most frightening of all, however, was a question asking if they had any reservations upon the citizens who refused to turn over their personal firearms as part of a gun confiscation program. The survey was given to Marines on May 10th at the 29 Palms Marine Corps base located on the southeast corner of the Mojave Desert, about 70 miles due south of San Bernardino, California, just east of Los Angeles. Among other things, the Marine facility is the site of the Corps' I can't read that, commanded by Brigadier General Sutton, an Expeditionary Air Force, which is used as a test and training center for the Marines of the 1st Unmanned Aerial Vehicle Combat Company, which utilizes unmanned aerial drones intended for long-range reconnaissance purposes. According to a young Marine who provided a copy of the survey to the Spotlight, it was given by a naval commander who claims he was working on his master's degree and was writing his thesis about giving up our military sovereignty to the United Nations Secretary General. Those taking the survey were limited to veterans of Operation Just Cause, the U.S. invasion of Panama, Operation Desert Storm, the war against Iraq, or Operation Restore Hope, the supposed humanitarian mission to feed starving Somalians. While the surveys were being passed out to the young Marines, one was able to obtain 2 copies from the pile of questionnaires. Under the heading Combat Arms Survey, the questionnaire stated that question is to gather data concerning the attitude of combat-trained personnel with regards to non-traditional missions. All of your responses are confidential. Write your answers directly in the questionnaire form. In Part 2, place an X in the space provided for your response. The series of situations posed to the servicemen is as follows. The U.S. runs a field training exercise. UN combat troops should be allowed to serve in U.S. combat units during these exercises under U.S. command and control. The United Nations runs a field training exercise. U.S. combat troops under U.S. command and control should serve in UN combat unit during these exercises. The UN runs a field training exercise. U.S. combat troops should serve under UN command and control during these exercises. U.S. combat troops should participate in UN missions under United Nations command and control. U.S. combat troops should be commanded by UN officers and non-commissioned officers at battalion and company levels while performing UN missions, and it goes on and on. I feel the President of the United States has the authority to pass his responsibilities as Commander-in-Chief to the Secretary General. I feel there is conflict, and it goes on. But to make a long story short, one of the questions, as you can see, was I would fire upon U.S. citizens who refuse to resist confiscation of firearms banned by the U.S. government. The results of the survey were not available right there, but the ultimate result was 75% of the Marines said that they would not fire on a fellow citizen. And unfortunately, 25% said that they would fire on a fellow citizen. I wanted to get into some other case files and some specifics for the next 2 hours. And so I basically, that's basically the situation as of this first 2 hours. Thanks.